Good day and welcome to the Thunder Bay Superior North Candidates Forum, hosted by the Anishnawbe Business Professional Association and the Thunder Bay Chamber of Commerce. My name is Charlotte Robinson. I'm the president of the Thunder Bay Chamber of Commerce, and I'm pleased to serve as your moderator. We begin with the acknowledgement that the City of Thunder Bay has been built on the traditional lands of the Ojibwa peoples of the Fort William First Nation, original signatories to the Robinson Superior Treaty signed in 1850, and we recognize the significant contributions of the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples to our heritage, social, cultural, spiritual, and economic wealth. Our thanks to our supporting media partner, Netnewsledger, and our venue host, Trinity Hall. I'll ask anyone in the room to please put your cell phone on silent for the duration. The order of speaking has been determined by draw, and questions will rotate from right to left. Questions will be posed to the candidates by our panelists, and each candidate will have 60 seconds for their answer, with the receiving candidate wrapping up with a 30-second rebuttal. I will raise a notice card when there are 10 seconds left, and will cut you off when your time runs out. We do remind the candidates that you have pledged to be respectful of each other, to not engage in name-calling, and to not interrupt each other when speaking. Candidates will not use inappropriate language and will follow the direction of the moderator. Our panelists today are Jason Racevich, President of the Anishnawbe Business Professional Association, and Riley Burton, Chair of the Board, Thunder Bay Chamber of Commerce. So let's get started with 1-minute opening statements by each candidate. Our first candidate, Chantal Bryson Ndp.
Thank you, Charla. Chantal Bryson, your federal NDP candidate for Thunder Bay Superior North. The NDP and I are firmly committed to an effective and fair economic and social recovery. We'll shift the cost burden to large corporations and the ultra-wealthy to continue to support our industries, small business, worker rights, safety, and pensions, increased health care, mental health, and addiction services, and real equity and justice for Indigenous kids, families, survivors, and communities. As a regional lawyer, I've worked with the municipalities and First Nations in our riding for about 2 decades, so I know the issues on the ground. And I have the skills, experience, and most importantly, the professional integrity to advocate fiercely for effective solutions to our real problems. Vote for needed change in Thunder Bay Superior North. Vote for integrity and the NDP, who have you, your families, our local businesses and communities at the heart of their commitments.
Perfect. Okay, why is that not stopping? Okay. Thank you, Chantelle. Our next opening statement is from Amanda Moddejonge of the Green Party of Canada.
This election should not be happening. Canadians don't need and Canadians don't want endless elections in the middle of a pandemic. The fact that this government called the election when they did demonstrates how very out of touch they are. We're approaching close to 2 years since SARS-CoV-2 was first discovered. At what wave will our leaders accept responsibility for their ongoing failures? During a pandemic, the government should not be encouraging activities that will require people to unnecessarily interface with others outside of their social bubble. This is just good science. What the government should have been doing was focusing on Afghanistan. Thunder Bay Superior North now has a chance to elect the leadership that it desperately needs. Send me to Ottawa and I will protect our northern lands. I will always have Lake Superior's best interest at heart, especially when it comes to nuclear waste. I am asking for your support in this election so we can establish honest, ethical, caring leadership. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. Our next candidate is Joshua Taylor with the Conservative Party of Canada.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Joshua Taylor, the Conservative candidate for the Conservative Party of Canada, and I'm running in this election that absolutely nobody wanted. When I went to Western, people knew 2 things about Thunder Bay. It's very cold, and it is the murder capital of Canada most times. And that should not be our claim to fame. It shouldn't be our claim to fame at all. So I'm running to keep communities safe and on representation. My parents grew up in the north as well, and one of the main things that they always felt like there was no representation in smaller communities. And this lack of representation means that we can't have adequate representation in Ottawa if there's no representation within our riding. And so I would like to be that representation in Ottawa to ensure that we are no longer the murder capital of Canada, the fentanyl overdose capital of Canada, and that we can actually have representation from both the urban and the rural areas in our riding.
Thank you, Joshua. Our final statement is from Patty Hajdu, Liberal Party of Canada.
Canadians have a big decision to make. Will we keep moving forward on reconciliation, on protecting our climate, on a stronger, inclusive economy, or will we let Erin O'Toole take us backwards? In all my conversations, one thing's been clear. People want to keep the progress that we've gained. They want healthier, safer communities where everyone has that fair chance to succeed. They want to continue investing in our youth, seniors, environment, and economic future. And people want a government that takes our health seriously. That's what we've done since 2015. And in 2020, as we faced the pandemic together, we stopped at nothing to keep Canadians safe. We funded research, helped provinces with money, equipment, and vaccines, helped workers, families, and businesses. Together, we came through some tough times. But we also stayed the course on building up communities. Despite the pandemic, I worked hard to ensure our riding got the funding it deserves for the projects we need. And at the door, people have shared their hopes for the months and years ahead. Thank you, Thunder Bay Superior North. You're worth fighting for, and I've got the experience to do it.
Thank you, Patty. So our first question will come from Jason at the ABPA and will be posed to Amanda from the Green Party. Jason.
Thank you. In June 2021, the federal government passed Bill C-15 as a framework to help ensure Canada's legislation reflects Indigenous rights as set out in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Free prior informed consent related to projects that may affect Indigenous people or First Nations territories is a major component of UNDRIP. However, the meaning of this principle has yet to be fully defined. Free prior informed consent uncertainty is already causing significant barriers to foreign investment and delays in decision making over major projects in Canada. Waiting for clarification through court adjudication will take years that Canada simply does not have. If elected, how will your party proactively work to define the meaning and practical implementation of free prior informed consent related to major projects impacting Indigenous peoples?
I think it's been. In my experience, consent is one of those things that this government does not understand, and I am saying this specifically with regards to the environmental approval process. And one of the things that generally happens is lack of acknowledgement or lack of explaining what's actually going on. So as long as the government doesn't experience any pushback, they take that as somebody is saying yes and that they agree to something. So one of the things that we actually are going to do is implement the Council of Canadian Governments. So what that does is allows every level of government to actually have these conversations. So it wouldn't just be to the federal or the provincial level. You'd also have your municipalities and First Nations communities involved as well. So you can have open discussions as to what the needs and what the realities of all projects are. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. Joshua.
Yeah, in order to properly address this concern, of course, like we need to ensure that Indigenous organizations and Indigenous groups, First Nations, are involved in absolutely every part of the process. We need to, as we're even suggesting a project begins, we need to ensure essentially that we are in communication with the relevant First Nations that has the possibility of affecting, and we can't treat them like one homogeneous group. We need to essentially ensure that self-determination is at the forefront in every decision that's made throughout the environmental assessment, throughout essentially the economic feasibility portions of it. And so what we need to do is basically allow First Nations to elect representatives on their own terms and their own ways to guide our process of ensuring that they're actually represented and that their environmental concerns are taken seriously.
Thank you. Patty Hajdu.
Thanks. Well, Yesterday, there was a landmark decision by an Ontario court that said that Ganoogaming was not properly consulted, and it stopped the mining exploration dead in its tracks. And that's why we passed Bill C-69 federally, because we wanted to make sure that there was a clarity in purpose around consultations and that there was a full inclusion of Indigenous voices in those consultations. In fact, the Conservative Party fought tooth and nail against Bill 69 because, of course, they don't really appreciate the rights of Indigenous people, nor do they understand a treaty nation-to-nation relationship. We're going to continue to support Indigenous-led processes for rebuilding and reconstituting nations, advance self-determination, and work in partnership on implementations, treaties, land claim, and self-government agreements. That's the way forward. It's actually respecting treaties. It's actually working and implementing legislation, including passing the UN declaration that brings Indigenous people to the table, to the forefront, I would argue, of these decisions. That's how we get things built in Canada, not by trying to go around Indigenous communities.
Thank you. Chantelle Bryson.
Hi, I've worked with Indigenous communities on these issues for about 25 years. The biggest impediment are governments that don't actually believe in First Nations sovereignty and Indigenous communities' sovereignty. And the Liberals are a classic example of this. They do not provide equitable funding for services on reserve. They do not provide funding to engage in these consultation processes that require substantive studies and reports. They do not fund the process itself. They dump it to corporations. The process often falls apart and they end up in court. The honor of the Crown is meaningless to the Liberal and Conservative governments. What we need to do is to ensure sustainable funding so communities can develop relationships with corporate actors before the process begins and deadlines are set, and then to allow for proper outcomes. And simply, the Liberals and Conservatives can't be trusted to do this.
Thank you. Our next question is from Riley Burton from the Chamber of Commerce, and the first response will come from, oh, I'm sorry. Amanda, you get 30 seconds to rebut. Did you have anything you want to rebut on that one?
Absolutely.
My apologies. 30 seconds.
One of the things that I've heard mentioned here is the landmark decision from yesterday, and I think that one of the important things that is not being discussed anywhere near strongly enough is that First Nations communities have to now pay for all of the legal representation and the court process, which is, it's way too expensive, and they need to have more support available so that should they enter into one of these situations, they can actually fund it.
Thank you. Now moving to Riley from the Chamber, and the first question goes to the Conservative candidate, Josh Taylor.
Thank you, Charla. We seem to be on to projects, so I think we'll continue on that theme. I'd ask you to reflect on sort of regulatory barriers to our projects. So as other nations dedicate funds to a green recovery, Ontario's mining and forestry sectors are well positioned to provide Canada and its trading partners with a reliable source of primary resources required for electric vehicles, computer chip manufacturing, buildings, and more. Cohesive strategies and targeted investments in Northern Ontario will be necessary to meet the growing demand for these types of products. How will your party ensure that regulatory barriers are addressed so that Canada's mining and forestry potential can be realized?
I mean, of course, we need to balance regulation and environmental impacts. I think one of the first things we need to be able to do is look at the feasibility of everything, and also we need to ensure that the clock doesn't keep getting stopped by things which could have been seen ahead of time in terms of environmental assessments. Additionally, if you look at the palladium mine, which is potentially a huge impact out of Marathon, I think we need to be able to really ensure that we're communicating with all of the potential partners in these. That way we're all in agreement with where we are and where we'd like to go. Going forward, I think, of course, any environmental impact should attempt to be offset by by greenhouse gas capture carbon capture technology, essentially. That way we can try to use our innovations at the same time as we're also harvesting our resources.
Thank you. Patty Hajdu.
It's important that I think we need to reflect back on the previous conversation, and it's important to remember that projects are not going to get built unless it's in full partnership with Indigenous communities, especially when we're talking about developing Northwestern Ontario, which is about as we have historically seen, resource extraction, including forestry and mining. And that's why funding and supporting things like the Ogoki Forest Management Corporation, which pulls in Indigenous communities and supports Indigenous communities to lead this economic development, is really a game changer. When Indigenous people have a seat at the table, financial benefit that's more than a few paid jobs, that's when we're going to start to see environmentally appropriate and economically profitable development of Northwestern Ontario. But it has to be done together, and it has to be more than offering a few token jobs. It has to be about the prosperity of everyone in our region.
Thank you. Chantelle Bryson.
I also want to begin with reflecting on the last part of the conversation, that without equitable funding for fundamental services on reserves, such as education and then post-secondary education, there is no meaningful ability to participate in extending mines and forestry and the absolute inherent right of duty to consult. Further, the Conservative government wants to retract the duty to consult per the Senate report, which is just a disaster. When projects fail, they fail for all of us. I've been pushing for municipalities and First Nations to work together to strive for that equity so duty to consult can be fulfilled. The assessments are not the problem. It's the lack of ability to participate in the process that interferes with them. The Liberal government has a blatant record of disregard for Section 35 rights and inequity on reserves and in post-secondary education and duty to consult support. That needs to end if we're going to prosper.
Thank you. And Amanda Moddejonge.
I'm really glad that my friend Chantal brought up the issue of funding because one of the Green Party initiatives is to establish a Canadian Sustainable Generations Fund to make critical investment in trades, apprenticeships, and education required for all of this. The reality of it is if you don't understand the framework in which you're dealing, you can neither represent your own interests or deal with the interests of those around you who maybe don't necessarily care about how their projects are actually going to affect the community going forward. So this is how you actually secure your better jobs and make sure that these projects go forward in a way that is equitable for everybody. Thank you.
And Joshua, did you want 30 seconds for rebuttal on anything?
Sure, yeah. So in terms of Indigenous consultation, which I think, of course, is at the forefront, I mean, we can't go back to looking at Indigenous people like they're a homogeneous group. Even within any First Nation community, we will see varying interests relative to the environmental impact versus the economic potential of each one. So we can't continue to look at Indigenous people like they are one homogeneous group, because, I mean, that does absolutely nothing for them.
Thank you. Back to Jason from the ABPA with our next question, which will be responded to first by Patty Hajdu.
Okay, this question focuses on climate change. It is anticipated that Indigenous people will be among the most negatively impacted by the effect of climate change due to factors related to systemic inequality and geographic location. We've seen that every year in Northwestern Ontario with the declining time frame for the winter road season and the challenges that poses for community needs, community supply chain, and safety for community members to travel, as well as the ranging forest fires in Northern Ontario, Manitoba, and British Columbia this summer are all case in point. If elected, what will your party do to mitigate the risks to Indigenous peoples from the negative effects of climate change?
Well, thank you, Jason, and I'm really glad that you've asked about not just how we're going to stop climate change, but how we're going to adapt our communities and our regions to the reality of climate change. And indeed, that's part of our plan, is making sure that we have a national adaptation strategy, and this development has begun. And of course, Indigenous people will be at that table to make sure that the adaptation strategy includes the reality of remote communities, rural communities, communities that don't have access through roads or other forms of transportation. And there's a lot to do. There's a lot to do in partnership with Indigenous communities. I think about the funding that was provided to the Gull Bay First Nation to green their grid and to get more people off of propane. I think about the partnerships with Indigenous people about preserving the land and the conservation work that we're doing in partnership with Indigenous peoples, the keepers of the parks, and in pulling Indigenous communities to ensure that parks are maintained in partnership with First Nations.
Thank you. Chantelle Bryson.
All right. Yes, partnerships require sustainable funding. They require sustainable funding for safe housing, for road access. The Liberal government has committed to hire more firefighters, but at the same time it bought a pipeline. It gave $18 billion in oil and gas subsidies last year alone. That is not progress. The NDP will provide equity to First Nations to make sure their communities are safe. They will heavily invest in green infrastructure and green energy. They will not be buying any pipelines. They will reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 50% of the 2005 levels by 2030. And they will stop subsidies altogether. We have a community and a region on fire. We cannot wait for a Liberal plan to turn into reality. We need real action now.
Thank you. Amanda Moddejonge.
There's several things that I could go on about with the Green Party's climate change strategy, but there's only a couple that I really want to highlight. One of the first things that we're going to do is direct the Canada Infrastructure Bank to revamp, to exclude private profit in infrastructure, and to invest in climate-proofing essential infrastructure, prioritizing upgrades to drinking water and wastewater systems to protect against flooding, droughts, and contamination. This is absolutely critical because, as we see now, we still don't even have clean drinking water on all First Nations. And wastewater is one of those things that is terribly always ignored. One of the things that I see constantly is you have a wastewater outflow going towards the drinking water inflow, which causes major problems. So if you can't get that right, how are you supposed to get the rest of the critical things needed to deal with climate change? We're also going to increase forest fire preparedness, including buying water bombers and ensuring they can be deployed rapidly in high-risk zones. We need quicker response than we have, and we need to prepare for it now.
Thank you. And Joshua Taylor.
Yeah, so I think one of the most important things we need to do is take steps to reasonably mitigate the risk of the effects of climate change, especially around First Nations communities. So if that includes something like creating a firewall around a community where immediate structures won't be burned if a fire does unfortunately come near that community, that would be one step. But overall, in terms of reducing climate change globally, we need to have a global approach. I mean, Canada only roughly contributes about 2% of the greenhouse gases across the world, and we need to hold the big polluters accountable, like China, India, and the United States, to ensure that overall we can mitigate global greenhouse gas emissions and not just Canada's. I think we need to do this by helping to transition from subsistence fuels in some countries by using liquid natural gas. And that way they can reduce their greenhouse emissions, and as a world we can all reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, and that way we can mitigate the effects of climate change here by using a global approach.
Thank you. 30 seconds, Patty Hajdu for rebuttal.
Well, I think you can see that the Conservatives' answer is we won't do anything till China will. And the NDP answer is that their plan is better. But in fact, both Tom Mulcair, Andrew Weaver, the former leader of the Green Party of BC, and a leading climate expert, Mark Jackert, have given the Liberal plan the best scoring for both practicality, GHG targets, and costs of promises. I think what people forget is that these are real working people, and transition takes time. But the plan is aggressive. We were the first party in the history to put a price on pollution. The Conservatives stalled and dragged their heels.
I got to stop you there. Thank you, Patty. Our final question from Riley Burton at the Chamber of Commerce goes to Chantelle Bryson as a start.
Thank you. We're all excited for recovery, but especially those chamber members that have been hardest hit. It's important for us to get the recovery right. If elected, what will your party do to facilitate an equitable recovery for some of the sectors most severely impacted by the pandemic, including women, Indigenous peoples, and racialized peoples?
Thank you. Well, as I said in my opening, the NDP is all about a fundamental shift in fairness. Both the Conservatives and Liberals want to continue to overtax you and me and small business. They've voted against small business tax relief, the ultra wealth tax, etc. Only the NDP is committed to a fundamental shift in taxation to the ultra wealthy and the large corporations, especially those who benefited disproportionately from the pandemic. They will then take those funds and turn them around to provide a safe and effective economic and social recovery, continuing to support local industries with the transition to green infrastructure and energy, small business through the rest of the pandemic with hiring bonuses, 1% caps, and credit card transactions and their practical realities. This is the fundamental shift the NDP are all about.
Thank you. Amanda?
Perfect. We're talking about recovery here, and we're still not even really in the mitigation stage. And I'm saying that from an environmental and emergency management standpoint. And I have more than 20 years of pandemic planning experience. One of the first things that the Green Party is going to do is implement the guaranteed livable income. And I think after we've all experienced the benefits of CERB, we know actually what the benefits are. We're also experiencing what happens after they take these programs away. And as we're still going into the recovery phase, we need to have that support in right there ready for us so that we can do the things like the education, the changes in the jobs, all of the things that need to happen in order to get back to a normal way of life.
Joshua?
Yeah, I mean, we need to ensure that there are businesses there for people to work at, to be employed at, and to start up. And ultimately, what we need to do is we need to help these businesses start up because a lot of people don't necessarily have the capital to start new businesses. And so what we're going to do, if a business is trying to hire, to ensure that they hire equitably, they will absolutely need the funds. So for the first 6 months of a new hire, we'll pay 50% of the wage. Additionally, to support small businesses in the time where there should be the largest influx of capital into them, what we'll do is that we'll create a GST holiday in the time where the most capital essentially flows through these businesses. That would be in the Christmas season. So we will not, the government won't collect any of the GST during that time. So there will be more likely, there will be a higher likelihood that people will actually go and purchase from these small businesses, which should allow them to recover some, if not a big portion of what they lost throughout the pandemic.
Thank you. Patty Hajdu?
Well, thank you. Listen, there are so many things in our platform that are about protecting the most vulnerable and building on the work that we've been doing around vulnerable groups. First of all, strategies have to be distinct. So we have strategies for Black business owners, for Indigenous business, for women. Of course, we need stronger protections for vulnerable workers, and our government commits to working on standards, including pay for caregivers in home care and other kinds of places. I can't it would be remiss of me not to mention the affordable $10 a day childcare agreements that the Conservative Party has said they'll rip up if they're elected. This is a game changer for women, regardless of their background, to be able to get into the workforce, to be able to stay in the workforce. And Procurement Canada, using Procurement Canada to buy from Indigenous owners with a 5% target. These are the kinds of things that actually move the needle. You can't say that you're going to provide just extra money to businesses to become more diverse without any kind of strategy behind that. And a Liberal government has that strategy.
Thank you, Patty. And final rebuttal to Chantelle Bryson, 30 seconds.
Thank you. I know the one thing in talking to small business and industries that they need in the recovery is not more loans. They've maxed out the $60,000 in loans offered by the Liberals, which will take them years to pay off, even once they're at full operation. And the Conservatives offering $200,000 in loans is not helpful. They need sustained subsidies until we're out of the pandemic. And then we need to focus on pharmacare, childcare, and mental health and addiction services to make sure people are healthy and able to return to their full productivity.
Thank you. So that concludes the Thunder Bay Superior North Candidates Forum hosted by the Anishnawbe Business Professional Association and the Thunder Bay Chamber of Commerce. Our thanks again to our supporting media sponsor, Netnewsledger, and our venue host, Trinity Hall. Please tune in for the Thunder Bay Rainy River Candidates Forum, which we posted online at tvchamber.ca on Friday, September the 10th at 5 p.m. Thank you.
Thank you for taking the time this afternoon for this debate. Politics is important, and this election is different than any election I think we've ever seen. And we'll start off our questions, which were submitted by Netnewsledger readers, with Chantelle Bryson, working our way across from Amanda from the Green Party, Josh from the Conservative Party, over to Patty Hajdu from the Liberal Party. And our first question, as the federal member of Parliament, what will you do to make Thunder Bay Superior North a better place for all the people here?
Right. Well, I think what we've seen under 6 years of Liberal government is the centralization under Justin Trudeau and his unethical and ineffective behavior and governance. So the first thing the NDP and I would do would be to commit to fight ferociously for Thunder Bay Superior North and the actual needs in our community. It's very disturbing when we have a cabinet minister who's the health minister, and yet our mental health and addictions crisis has spun out of control, not just in Thunder Bay, but in every community in our riding. So what we need is a return to professional integrity, someone who will fight for the communities in this riding, not fight for Justin Trudeau on a daily basis.
Amanda.
Thank you. I think that my friend Chantal hit a very critical issue there with mental health issues. I remember myself actually watching a friend of mine standing in front of Justin Trudeau and actually ask, when are we going to have mental health services available in First Nations communities? This is long overdue. This is also an issue in the veteran community. We have no access to mental health, and this is an actual crisis. So as we have the Prime Minister currently vilifying people for having differences of opinion, we need to actually have something in place so that people can deal with these things. But the Green Party overall, what we're going to do is stop dividing people and bring them together. Thank you.
And over to Josh. Thank you, Amanda.
All right, yeah, so I mean, right at the beginning, two things. First, I want to ensure that the rural areas are actually represented. I went up to Armstrong and Karamat, and they basically said they hadn't seen a politician in forever, and I want to ensure that this riding is actually represented, every part of it. I don't think it just needs to be Thunder Bay, it needs to be Thunder Bay Superior North, and so that is exactly what I will do. I will make sure at every possible step that all the voices within the riding are heard, not just a select few that are convenient. After that, I will address the crime problem, which we clearly have coming in from gangs in Southern Ontario, bringing in large amounts of fentanyl and really exploiting our most vulnerable people, our Indigenous people, our elderly, our disabled, and trafficking fentanyl here, and that's contributing to so much of the addiction problem that we have here, is a lot of the gang-oriented trafficking. So, I mean, those are two. I mean, there's a lot more, but those are my two priorities right away.
Thank you. And Patty Hajdu.
Well, thank you. Over the past 2 years, I've brought in over $400 million for Thunder Bay Superior North, about $200 million here in Thunder Bay and $250 million in the region. What was that for? It was for water projects and marinas. It was for mental health programs. It was for programs that serve Indigenous youth, like the Choose Life program. It was for things like airport renewal. It was for things like business development. And it was things for doubling of Fed North's funding and their independence. I'll continue to do that. I'll continue to listen to the voices of the riding and fight for every dollar, every bit of focus that this riding deserves. I want to say to my colleagues who are concerned about mental health, especially their own, please don't forget to check out wellnesstogether.ca. This is a free national mental health program launched at the beginning of COVID-19, completely free of charge, provides individual customized care for any Canadian that needs it in both official languages and translated to 60 others. Help is on the way for those that need it. Thank you.
Thank you, Patty. And over to Chantelle for 30 seconds rebuttal.
Thank you. Again, telelines and phone lines are cheap and they're ineffective. What we need to address the crime situation and the mental health and addiction explosion in our communities throughout the riding is sustainable funding for street-level services. We have the practitioners in our community that know what they need to do, and that will drastically reduce crime. The problem is the Liberals don't fund it. They throw up big numbers with no plan and no results.
Thank you. And we'll move on with our second question to Amanda from the Green Party. The discovery of mass graves at the sites of several residential schools across Canada has brought increased focus to the country's past atrocities against Indigenous people. How would your party move forward with the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission? And is there anything that you would do to forward the cause of reconciliation with Indigenous people in Canada?
There's so many things that we will do, and the biggest thing that we're going to do is actually open up a real dialogue, not just the ceremonial recognition, things that really don't do anything, but say, hey, we see you there and we understand there's a problem. We're actually going to talk about the problems and get to the bottom of them. The biggest problem right across the board is legislation, and it's the things that actually allow these things to happen. So when you have a government that's actually saying, no, we need to take these kids out of their homes and we're going to do it legislatively, that's wrong. That was always wrong on every single level. But then to put it back on the church and say it's solely the church's fault, no, it wasn't. The legislation actually allowed that to happen and forced it to happen. So rather than sitting here laughing as people are actually coming up with real solutions here, we're going to talk to real people, Patty.
Thank you, Amanda. Over to Josh.
In terms of what happened to the Indigenous people, there's every government historically is to blame, and I don't think there's any avoiding that. We have failed the Indigenous people on every conceivable level, on every way you can basically imagine, and whatever we do right now is really only a step towards reconciliation. But what we're going to do immediately as the Conservatives is fulfill 71 through 76 of the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action. We'll pay for absolutely everything that needs to be done to ensure that the burials and the recognition of those people lost in the residential school system is done in a culturally relevant way, and we need to ensure essentially that this never happens again. And so what we also need is education on the history of the residential school system, so it's more known to the Canadian public and they don't just get sound bites.
Thank you. And Patty.
Well, thank you very much for the question. And I just want to return to some of the comments around funding. You know, under the Conservative government, they held steady at about $12 billion of funding towards Indigenous needs and all kinds of different projects, including mental health, including Jordan's Principle, including all of the kinds of infrastructure that we're seeing being built right now. Under Justin Trudeau's Liberals, in fact, that number is at $25 billion now, more than double than what the Conservatives held that amount at for over a decade. Reconciliation is, of course, about changing legislation, but it's also about equity. It is about making sure that Indigenous people, like the ones in our riding, lead the way in developing programs that are custom fit for their own particular communities and their own particular needs. That's what a Liberal government will continue to do.
Thank you. And over to Amanda for a 30-second rebuttal. Sorry, Chantal, I'm sorry.
Hi. The first thing, the NDP is fully committed to actually implement the TRC calls to action and the murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls calls to justice. We want every child to be brought home and perpetrators to be held accountable. We will end the litigation against St. Anne's residential school survivors, have the documents disclosed to them that the Liberals have been fighting to withhold for 6 years. It's absolutely morally bankrupt to withhold the history from survivors who have incomplete memories and to prevent the perpetrators from being brought to justice. The NDP will do that. Again, integrity matters. We throw around these numbers, billions, but the fact is the Liberals don't measure for equity in any Indigenous services. And the reason why they don't measure for it is so they don't have to provide it.
Thank you. Our next question.
Wait.
Oh, Amanda for rebuttal. I'm sorry.
No, it's good. Thank you. I think it's really important to remember that the Liberal track record is the white paper. And so to sit here and actually say that, you know, the Conservatives did this, this party did that, let's get back to basics. You need to actually recognize what's on the books, what the rights are, and one of the best things that you can do is get actually educated by Indigenous people as to what the reality of the situation is. And the only way you can make that happen is put them in positions where they can teach.
Thank you, Amanda. Our next question, we'll start with Josh. Thunder Bay and our region has seen increased overdoses and increased violent crime as a result of drug trafficking. What will you and what will your party do to combat this growing problem?
Yeah, absolutely. And with a background in criminology, I feel like it's different to understand crime as someone from a theoretical background versus someone who's had to live it. And I've been blessed to not have to experience crime myself, but having worked in 911, having worked in the bail system, I've seen people who are the victims of crime. And what we need to do is really cut the source off where it needs to be cut off, and that's from the violent gangs coming in from Southern Ontario. They come in here and they capitalize upon our most vulnerable people. They bring in massive amounts of drugs, which are really contributing to the addiction problem that we have here. And I think if we can cut that off, that's a step in the right direction. Also, we need to stop the violent domestic abuse situations, which we've really seen an uptick in since the beginning of COVID, when people are forced together and tensions rise. And what we need to do is we need to ensure that people who are committing acts of domestic violence are put in jail if it's a repeat offense. We need to ensure that there are mandatory minimums for that kind of violence.
Thank you, Josh. And over to Patty.
Well, thanks, James. And this is something I've spent a lot of time thinking about and working on. And in fact, it's a Liberal government that's been making tangible and strong investments in provinces and territories to deliver on mental health. We're working on mental health standards right now with provinces and territories so that Canadians can understand what they can expect from their healthcare systems provincially and territorially. We would also increase the health transfer of $4.5 billion on top of what we've already committed, bringing the annual funding transfers to provinces for mental health and substance use to $2.5 billion. We've also worked extensively with communities through the Substance Use and Addictions Program, funding programs like Norwest Community Health Centers to deliver harm reduction programs to meet people where they're at with their substance use. And finally, I'll say, we need to stop talking about this as a criminal issue. This is a health issue. And the Liberal government has been working with many jurisdictions across the country on tools that will meet their needs to help them save lives.
Thank you. And Chantelle.
Absolutely agree. Criminalization does not work. It's incredibly expensive and incredibly ineffective. Mandatory minimums also don't work. All the mandatory minimums brought in by the Harper government were quickly struck down by the courts because circumstances vary and they're more than capable of addressing them. Violent offenders are dealt with accordingly. But we do have to deal with the root causes. We have to deal with poverty and the mental health issues and the physical health issues that come with poverty that lead people into addiction and into gangs. We have to deal with the poverty that leads kids into gangs and lures in human trafficking victims. The fact in this community is but Norwest Health and all the other service agencies are grossly underfunded. They get elections sprinkles and crisis sprinkles, proposal funding. They get no sustainable funding to actually provide the services needed on the ground that they know how to provide.
Thank you, Chantelle. And over to Amanda.
There's a few things that the Green Party is very, very focused on doing. One of those things being decriminalization of personal use of any kind of narcotic. The way to treat that is not to criminalize it ever, because then what you do is you're just putting it into an industry that makes other people money, and other people should not be making money off people's misery. So in addition to that, we will be implementing the guaranteed livable income, and that's one of those things that we've seen, especially over this pandemic. It's absolutely critical, and it changes people's lives. It puts them in a position where they can make things better without the stress and the overall fear of not knowing where their money's coming from.
Thank you, Amanda. And Josh, you've got 30 seconds.
Yeah, so in terms of substance users themselves, of course, they should not be criminalized for having an addiction, which is very unfortunate. But in terms of the people bringing the drugs in here, we really need to address that. And clearly, we've been murder capital of Canada and fentanyl overdose capital of Canada for a long time. The Liberals had 6 years to address that, and clearly we're still up there. So whatever they're doing or are planning on doing should have been done already and isn't working.
Thank you. And we'll go to our next question, Patty. The pandemic has shown that there's a great number of gaps in our society. In the region and across Northern Ontario, problems with high-speed internet, access to safe drinking water, and access to intercommunity transportation are an issue. What will you and what will your party do to solve those problems?
Well, thanks, James. And I have to say that being a semi-rural member of parliament is really important to have at the decision-making tables, because I can bring the voices of communities right here in sometimes Thunder Bay, but also in rural communities to the table to make sure that we get at those infrastructure gaps. We've been heavily investing in broadband technology, and we plan to continue to do so. Working with partners like T-Baytel, but many others across the riding to ensure that we can expand access to broadband and finish that last mile of homes that are don't have access to broadband. But the infrastructure gap that you mentioned is also critically important. Making sure that we have affordable housing, units right here in Thunder Bay, working on transitional housing with places like the Salvation Army, making sure that long-term care homes have the kinds of ventilation and supports they need, another critical gap that we saw. And of course, the supports for mental health and substance use that my colleagues are talking about and that I've already illustrated are a top of priority for us.
Thank you. And over to Chantelle, same question.
Yeah, the NDP released its Northern Ontario platform today. We're the only party who has a dedicated platform to Northern Ontario due to our very specific needs, including our Indigenous communities. So the NDP is clearly committed to bring full broadband access to all communities, including Indigenous communities in our riding, not just tinkering at the edges of existing services. We're further in our Northern Ontario platform, we're firmly committed to reinstitute intercommunity transport that's necessary for people to see their families, to get to medical appointments, and just needed services in Thunder Bay. 6 years of Liberal government has done nothing to rectify this problem, so we need a change. In terms of the infrastructure gap, again, it all goes back to equity.
Thank you, Chantelle, and over to Amanda.
Over the last week or so, I've heard a lot of chatter about we're not going to let unvaccinated people on trains beside vaccinated people, and I think that's great. In Thunder Bay, we don't have a train, and that's a real problem. We don't have the transportation up here that we need, and we desperately need it. In addition to that, the services that we do have to fight tooth and nail for the funding that they deserve. We're just forgot about every which way. So the Green Party is 100% focused on ensuring we get the train back here the way we need to. We're also focused on ensuring that everybody has broadband service, because if we're all studying online, you need it. You can't go through school without it anymore, and this pandemic has proven that. And these are things we've been talking about since well before 2015.
Thank you, Amanda, and over to Josh.
I mean, so much of what has contributed to the mental health crisis that we're facing right now is isolation, and a lot of this isolation, it could have been mitigated by having a voice that you can speak to via, or being able to communicate via the internet. And only right now 24% of Indigenous communities actually have access to high-speed internet. Only 37% of rural households have high-speed internet, and as compared to 97% of urban ones. And by 2025, we will ensure that all Canadians are able to have access to high-speed internet so they can actually effectively communicate with one another. Also, we're going to be contributing to infrastructure projects for the roads, which need to be maintained here. Like, for example, between Thunder Bay and where I'm from, Geraldton, we see that highway is incredibly dangerous with the amount of traffic that is on it. So we need to make sure that if there's going to be a high amount of dangerous traffic, it needs to at least be well maintained to mitigate whatever possible risk there is to people who have to drive it so regularly.
Thank you. And Patty, over for 30 seconds.
Well, thanks again. I'll just reiterate that the money to the region that was received over the last 2 years is $250 million. In fact, $3.2 million going to Gull Bay to connect 689 households, and $208,000 to Greenstone for 145 disconnected or low-speed internet households. But let's not forget, I'm glad that my colleague brought up the highway. Let's not forget the $130 million that we added to that project, the project that's been underway for many years that will create safer roads for Northwestern Ontario.
Thank you. And we've got one more question, and then it'll be closing statements. And we'll start with Chantelle. Climate change continues to impact our region. Wildfires, longer heat waves, and unpredictable climate have all become the normal. What will you and what will your party do to ensure that our region gets the needed resources to combat this problem?
Well, the NDP are firmly committed to a far more aggressive climate change plan than the Liberals and the Conservatives. We're looking at a 50% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from the 2005 levels by 2030. Under the Liberal government, greenhouse gas emissions have actually gone up while they've subsidized the gas and oil industry. We will use further funding to retrofit all buildings by 2050 and also commit to electric vehicles by 2035 and actually making them affordable for people. So that, together with a massive investment in green infrastructure and green energy research and development, which will also help our students and transition our industries that are thriving but will need to make a move to further green energy, are our commitments to the region.
And Amanda.
The thing I like most about the Green Party is we are actually based in science, and that's because a lot of us are scientists. So I hate to go into this because it's nitpicky and terrible. However, one of the things that goes on often is we have governments that fund projects to say that they funded something that's great, and we saw this during the McGuinty government when they funded a whole lot of money for a whole lot of scrubbers, and then they did that to coal-fired refineries to turn around and close them really soon after. I'm not saying that the scrubbers weren't a good idea, they were great. But what I'm saying is spending millions and millions and millions of dollars on a project to turn around and shelve it is exactly what we don't need. We have way too much waste, so people can say, yay, we spent a bunch of money. We're going to stop that. We're actually going to have policies that are rooted in real science.
Thank you, Amanda. And over to Josh.
Yeah, I mean, I'd just like to touch on the same study that Patty had mentioned earlier. So Professor Jacquard from Simon Fraser University actually ranked ours just slightly behind the Liberals. So I guess the opportunity that, or the question you really have to ask yourself is who's actually going to get things done. And I think Conservatives have a track record, and that's also compared to the NDP, which he said was incredibly ineffective and incredibly expensive as well, with 6.5% of the annual GDP going towards that. In terms of innovations that we should be making to mitigate a lot of the effects of climate change here, we can use things such as remote sensing to ensure that fires are detected earlier before they really can expand. And basically, yeah, rely on innovation. And I think if we go with an innovative approach instead of the same old tired solutions to problems, we will be a lot better going forward.
Thank you, Josh. And over to Patty.
Well, thanks, James. I mean, every step of the way, I sat in Parliament and watched the Conservative Party scream against any action to protect the climate, whether it was Bill C-69 on responsible development, whether it was putting a price on pollution. In fact, they partnered up with Doug Ford, their buddy, to put stickers on gas pumps, which were then found later on to be illegal. So this is a party that doesn't have a great record of taking climate seriously. Our party does, though, James, and that's what's so important. It's not important just to talk about climate, it's important to have a plan. And our plan has been assessed, as he mentioned, by Mark Jacquard as being the leading plan, not only to get the job done, but to make sure that we don't harm Canada's economy and some of the most vulnerable workers. In fact, that's what he pointed out about the NDP plan. In fact, it would be harder on workers and lead to a precipitous drop in GDP. We know we need to get both things done. We have to protect the climate and we have to protect those vulnerable workers. Thank you.
Thank you. And over to Chantelle.
Yes, the Liberals are famous for plans. What the NDP are promising is actually binding green transition legislation. And what that would do is support workers and communities with firm commitments to funding and retraining to allow any lost jobs to move into the new industry. We would also have an Office of Environmental Justice to ensure we never have another Grassy Narrows. Yes, we got an election sprinkle of a treatment center. However, there's no commitment to clean up the river. The NDP are serious. We deal with root problems, and we will clean up the river.
Thank you very much. As I said, those were our tough questions from readers. And we'll move over now to closing statements. And we'll start with Amanda. Thank you.
Thank you. Canadians are more divided now than I've ever seen. We need a government that will unite Canadians, not divide them more. We need policies that encourage people to do what's right, not politicians demonizing them, especially when their skepticism of this government comes from a good, healthy place. We've seen too many failures with regard to COVID. All of the candidates here will say right now that we're ready for vaccine passports, and I will tell you honestly, this government is not ready to implement them. And if they were, this would be a federal initiative. We need more and better testing that's available at a realistic cost so that everybody has access, vaccinated or not. So better than that though, free testing. We need a Minister of Health that is able to lead their department to assess the 89 different applications for testing apparatuses that's currently in front of that department. Send me to Ottawa and I will fight for the implementation of real science in all decisions going forward. Thank you.
Thank you. And over to Josh.
Well, first of all, thank you to everyone for watching, and thank you to my fellow candidates. Although we have differences of opinion, I am very confident that every one of us has the best interest of the riding at heart. And with that being said, of course, it has been nearly 90 years since this riding has actually had a Conservative who was elected. And so please think carefully when you're wondering whose governance which problems arose under. If you are ready for change, and change for the better, that change can start with you. Vote Conservative. Thank you.
Thank you, Josh. And over to Patty.
I have the experience and determination to serve Thunder Bay Superior North the best. Our government has been relentless in our work to create a better Canada. And that record is strong. We've done big things like boosting CPP, reducing child poverty, taking historic action on reconciliation, and signed landmark trade agreements opening up new markets for Canadian businesses. In the fight against COVID-19, we led with billions for provinces, families, and businesses. We delivered more than 100 million vaccines and laid the foundation for Canada to be a global vaccine research and manufacturing powerhouse. In our riding, I've landed $400 million in new investments for the things our communities need on climate change, economic development, and infrastructure to keep us all going. I've been there throughout the pandemic, working with Northern and Indigenous leaders and Ontario to make sure our region got what it needed to keep people safe and get everyone vaccinated. We've done hard things together, and a Liberal government will continue to stand up for the things that matter: community, reconciliation, and inclusive economy, that fair chance for everyone.
Thank you. And over to Chantelle.
Thank you, James. Everyone in our riding is striving to return to some sense of normalcy without further fear of more lockdowns, illness, loss, interrupted employment and education, grossly delayed health services, unaddressed declining mental health, and now being burdened with the heavy debt incurred in large part to the Liberal government's lack of prevention and preparedness for this pandemic per the SARS 2006 final report, which laid it all out. It is time for change to bring about a fair and effective economic and social recovery, with the burden shifted upward to large corporations and the ultra-wealthy that benefit only themselves, their shareholders, and the Liberal and Conservative parties. Another Trudeau government would be a disaster for our riding, as would the blind loyalty shown by our local Liberal MP. Bring back a strong and independent voice for Thunder Bay Superior North, because the NDP is in it for you.
And that concludes the questions and the closing comments for our debate. I want to thank all of the parties, participants, for showing up today, for answering our questions, And I look forward to our readers having the chance to read these, and I do encourage everyone to get out and vote and to find out what the issues are that matter to you to make a decision in this very important election. Thank you very much.
Thank you, James.
Thank you.